Husband cheated on me with my sister. Said she's more fun than you. I found out he hadn't paid taxes in 10 years, reported him to the IRS, and got his accounts frozen. He owes $1 million and can't leave the state. The night I found out about Scott and my sister Jenna was burned into my memory like a bad movie you can't turn off. My husband Scott had been coming home late for weeks, with every excuse in the book. At first, I thought it was just work stress. He'd been taking on extra projects, staying late at the office, or so he claimed. But something had felt off, gnawing at me in the pit of my stomach. Then one night, I got a text from Jenna. "Can't wait to see you this weekend." Big plans, she'd written. Jenna was one of those people who could charm anyone, and she always had something going on. That weekend, she'd planned a birthday getaway, supposedly with friends, at this lake cabin we used to visit as kids. It was tucked away in the woods, near Maroon Lake in Colorado, peaceful and quiet. As soon as I got that message, an idea struck me. Why don't I surprise her? I thought, smiling at the idea of driving up there with a cake and a bottle of wine. She'd always been the one to make a fuss over birthdays. And I figured if Scott was still working late, maybe this would cheer me up. I'd missed Jenna lately, and something about surprising her seemed like the perfect distraction. So I drove out that Friday evening, winding through the dark, curvy roads that led up to the lake. When I arrived, the cabin was quiet, lights dimmed. I remember thinking it was strange that there weren't more cars, but I brushed it off. I was about to text her that I'd arrived, but something made me stop. Instead, I walked up to the door quietly, cake in hand, eager to catch her off guard. When I opened the door, my whole world turned upside down. There, sitting on the couch, was Scott, my husband, with Jenna straddling his lap, laughing softly as he brushed her hair from her face. They hadn't even noticed me, completely wrapped up in each other. My voice broke through the silence before I could stop myself. What the hell is going on here? Both of them froze. Jenna's face went pale, and Scott slowly looked up, his face a mix of shock and something else, something smug, like he was almost proud I'd caught him. I dropped the cake. I think I heard it hit the floor, but I was too focused on the two of them to care. Scott, as casual as ever, gave me this half smile. "Oh. Didn't think you'd be here, Anna." "Didn't think I'd be here?" I repeated, feeling my throat tighten with rage. So this is where all those late nights were going? With her? My own sister? Scott looked unfazed, almost bored. "Come on, Anna. Things just happen. You've been so tense, so boring lately. Jenna knows how to have fun." I turned to Jenna, who was looking at me with this small, defiant smirk. I could hardly believe it. My own sister, sitting there, acting like she hadn't just torn my life apart. "Really, Jenna?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "How long has this been going on?" She shrugged, playing with a strand of her hair, looking every bit like she was the victim here. "It's not like you two were happy. Scott deserves to have some fun, Anna. You're always so predictable." Predictable. That word stung. I'd always been the reliable one, the one who had a plan, who made sure things got done. And suddenly, that was a crime? Suddenly, that made me the one they both could toss aside? I clenched my fists, my whole body shaking with a mix of hurt and fury. "So you think this is okay? Just doing this behind my back?" Scott looked at me, almost amused, like I was the one overreacting. "Look, Anna, you're acting crazy. Can't we be adults about this?" "Adults?" I snapped, my voice breaking. "Is this what adults do, Scott? Betray each other with their own family?" Neither of them answered. Jenna had this look on her face, as if she was daring me to react, almost relishing the moment. Scott just shrugged, as if he couldn't care less. Something inside me broke. I didn't scream, didn't cry. I just looked at them both, as coldly as I could manage, and said, "You're not worth it. Either of you." And I walked out. I don't remember much of the drive back home, just that my hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard I thought I'd snap it in half. Once I got home, I locked myself in my room and just sat there in silence, staring at the walls. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I kept replaying their faces, their words, over and over. The next morning, Scott called me like nothing had happened. I let it go to voicemail, but the message he left me made my blood boil. "Hey, about the house and everything, why don't we keep things simple? I'll take over the mortgage payments. You can just move out. Start fresh," he'd said, like he was doing me a favor. I couldn't believe it. After everything, he was suggesting I just walk away and leave everything we'd built together. As if he hadn't just destroyed it all in one night. As if I was some burden he could discard. That was when I decided that I wasn't going to be the one who lost everything. I spent the next few days doing something I hadn't done in years, looking through our finances, really digging into every single bank statement, tax return, and expense report I could find. Scott had always handled the money, and I'd trusted him, blindly. But now I wanted answers. And I was determined to find them. As I went through everything, piece by piece, a horrifying realization started to take shape. Scott hadn't filed taxes in nearly a decade. Every year, he'd been skimming off the top, funneling money into hidden accounts, claiming business expenses that didn't exist. 10 years of lies, of hiding from the IRS, all while he was pretending to be this smooth, successful businessman. I felt a sick sense of satisfaction as I pieced it all together. He thought he was so clever, so untouchable. But here it was, plain as day. I gathered every single document, every statement, every shred of evidence and made a neat little file. Then, without a second thought, I sent it all to the IRS. A few weeks passed. I didn't hear anything, and I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake, if maybe he'd slipped through the cracks yet again. But then, one sunny afternoon, my phone rang. An IRS investigator was on the line, thanking me for my compliance and diligence. Apparently, my tip had cracked open a massive case they'd been building against Scott. They'd frozen his accounts, every single penny, pending an investigation. And with those accounts frozen, he was suddenly stuck. Couldn't pay his bills, couldn't even afford to leave the state without permission. It didn't take long before I started hearing from people, mutual friends, whispering about how Scott's life was falling apart. It was like watching a house of cards crumble in slow motion. Then, one afternoon, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Scott standing there, looking nothing like the smug, carefree man I'd caught with my sister. He looked disheveled, desperate, his face pale and drawn. "Anna. Please," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I need your help." "Help?" I repeated, crossing my arms, feeling nothing but contempt. "After everything you did? You think I'm just going to help you now?" He swallowed, looking down at his feet. "I didn't mean for things to go this far. It was just a mistake." "A mistake?" I said, my voice dripping with disbelief. "Scott, you didn't just make a mistake. You betrayed me with my own sister. You lied, cheated, and now you want sympathy?" He looked up, his eyes hollow. They're saying I could go to jail, Anna. I need a lawyer, money for everything. Please, you don't understand." I stared at him, finally seeing him for what he was, weak, desperate, nothing like the man I'd once loved. The thought of helping him felt ridiculous, almost laughable. "And why should I help you?" I asked coldly, feeling a strange calm settle over me. He had no answer. Instead, he just looked at me, his expression filled with the realization that he had nothing left, no one left. And that was when I knew, he was finally paying the price for everything he'd done. I stared at Scott for a long time, letting the silence between us grow heavy. He looked smaller than I remembered, almost pathetic standing there on my porch. There was no trace of the man who once filled a room with his confidence, who could charm anyone. Now he was just a man who had gambled everything and lost. "I'm sorry," he whispered, breaking the silence. "I know I've done horrible things. But I'm still your husband, Anna. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" I laughed. A hollow, bitter laugh. "You think being my husband gives you some kind of pass?" I stepped closer, watching him flinch. "You threw that title away the moment you betrayed me. You and Jenna deserve each other." He opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. "You know what? I'm done talking to you, Scott. Get off my porch and go find someone else to bail you out." He was trembling now, and I almost felt a flicker of pity. But then I remembered all the nights I'd spent alone, all the times I'd trusted him only to find out he'd been lying to me. This was karma. And I wasn't about to stand in its way. The next day, I got a call from Jenna. I didn't pick up, but her voicemail played in a loop in my head all day. She was crying, begging, saying she didn't know things would get this bad. She asked if we could talk, like sisters. I felt a surge of anger that was almost shocking. Sisters? She wanted to talk like sisters now? After what she'd done? I ignored the message, blocking her number. She could deal with the mess she'd made with Scott on her own. A few weeks later, I heard from mutual friends that Scott's life had completely unraveled. He couldn't access any of his funds, his accounts frozen, his reputation in tatters. People who'd once praised him now turned their backs, whispering about the IRS investigation and his unpaid taxes. He'd become a pariah. One afternoon, while I was out shopping, I ran into someone who used to work with Scott. His name was Martin, and he'd always been polite to me, even friendly. He greeted me with a knowing smile. "Anna," he said, almost in a whisper, "I heard what happened with Scott. And, well, I just wanted to say, you're better off without him." "Thanks, Martin," I said, genuinely touched. "It's been a rough ride." Martin nodded. "If you ever need anything, you've got people rooting for you. We all know Scott was, well, let's just say you were always the better half." That small encounter felt like a bomb. It was as if people were finally seeing me, recognizing that I wasn't the fool in this story. Scott had been the one spinning lies, not me. And now, he was paying for them. Days turned into weeks, and life began to feel normal again. I found a new apartment, a cozy little place near the city center, filled with light and peace. It was mine, my sanctuary. For the first time, I felt truly free. One evening, while sorting through my things, I came across an old envelope. Inside was a photograph of Scott and me, taken at a family gathering years ago. We looked happy, like two people who truly loved each other. I stared at the photo, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. I tore it in half and tossed it in the trash. The next day, I got an unexpected letter. It was from Jenna. She'd written it by hand, the handwriting almost childlike. She begged for forgiveness, saying she was lost and didn't know what she'd been doing. She wrote, "I miss you, Anna. Please, let's go back to how things were." I folded the letter, setting it aside. I'd already decided to leave Jenna in the past, just like Scott. They'd both shown me who they were, and I wasn't going to be their backup plan. They were on their own. Then, one final piece of news came that felt like the ultimate closure. Scott was officially charged with tax fraud, facing a hefty sentence. He'd have to sell what little he had left, his house, his car, all of it seized by the government. He wouldn't be able to afford a lawyer who could get him out of this mess. And Jenna? She had drained her savings trying to help him, only to find out that he'd betrayed her too, lying about debts and promising her money he didn't have. Scott and Jenna were both in ruin, tied to each other like two anchors sinking fast. The last I heard, Jenna was moving in with some distant relative, and Scott was facing years behind bars. I took a deep breath, feeling a peace I hadn't felt in ages. They were both out of my life, and I was free. I'd lost them, but I'd found myself in the process. And as I sat in my new place, I raised a quiet toast to karma, sweet, satisfying, and finally served.